Hello and welcome to the new episode of the All Walks of Life podcast. In today's episode, I sat down with Jon Mackenzie. He's a writer and podcaster in the football journalism sector. We spoke about things such as why the Saudis are interested in taking over Newcastle United, the landscape of football journalism with things like the prominence of the Athletic and how they're trying to revolutionize what football journalism is and how we as the general public consume it. Then again, we spoke about Bielsa and how Jon and I share a love for Bielsa, and Jon in particular is writing a book on Bielsa. So we had some really good discussions about Bielsa and just how he goes about life basically, and how he believes in a philosophy when he's looking at life, and how he's a totally complex character to understand. So it was a great pleasure speaking to Jon, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast. All right, Jon, welcome to the All Walks of Life podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Looking forward to chatting.
I mean, how have you been keeping yourself busy during this quarantine time?
Yeah, it's crazy. So I'm holed up in Birmingham, in the Midlands in the UK. My sister's got a house here, so I've been staying here with her and her husband while we've been in lockdown in the UK. And it's been going okay. I'm trying to... The first few weeks were weird. You just sort of got to get yourself into the right headspace psychologically, but just finding ways of keeping myself busy now and trying to find ways of being creative and produce content that's interesting at a time when there's not a huge amount going on in the world of football.
That's true. I mean, I go to university in the UK. I go to Loughborough, so thankfully I made it back in time. But I know a couple of friends who are still stuck in their dorm rooms or having to quarantine in the UK. So it's just better to stay home with family and things like that, in that sense. Jon, I wanted to touch...
It's tough.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go on.
No, I was just saying it's a tough time. I know a few people as well who are actually a few people from India and Pakistan who are studying in the UK, and they find themselves in sort of ghost towns of university campuses and
I mean,
in sort of 6 people flats with no one else there but themselves.
No, that's the thing about, like, so I go to Loughborough, and Loughborough is a university town. When the academic year is there, so it's really booming. But I'm guessing that when there are off seasons, it's probably going to be a ghost town, as you mentioned.
What are you studying at Loughborough?
I'm doing sport coaching and physical education. So
cool.
That's the primary reason I want to come to UK, because to make a name for myself in the football industry, if that makes sense.
There's nowhere better than Loughborough to be doing something like that, right?
Yeah, that's the whole thing. Yeah. So Jon, I want to touch upon. So I know you're quite into philosophy. When I was doing some research for this interview, I looked at some of your articles and how you always try to have an aspect of philosophy to your articles. So how did you get started, and what was your love for philosophy all about?
Yeah, so in many respects, I'm essentially a failed academic. I spent 10 years in British universities, both learning and lecturing, mainly focusing on issues of philosophy, but I was technically in theology faculties, so I did a general undergrad degree in divinity, and that allowed me to do a really broad gamut of different subjects. So I covered like the biblical languages, biblical criticism, but also church history, philosophy proper, and theological sciences as well. So it gave me a really good grounding in loads of different things. And then I went and did graduate work focusing mainly on, again, philosophy, but with philosophy adjacent to theology. So I spent up until about 2016, 2004 to 2016 I was in academia, but towards the end of my PhD, I did a PhD which I never ended up finishing. I'd started doing a lot of sports writing for various outlets, and the longer my PhD went on, the more I sort of wanted to go into more of a writing career, more of a journalism career. And part of the reason why the PhD never finished was because I struck it lucky a few times and got some decent gigs in journalism in the UK. So yeah, but that background has always stayed with me. That I think there's plenty of interesting aspects to football that don't really get covered. So it was a niche that I felt I could get into. I also find those aspects more interesting. I think there's a huge amount of mileage to cover questions that football sort of encompasses but never really gets dealt with in the media. So, for example, a topic like Saudi Arabia's investment group taking over Newcastle United is a really fruitful and rich vein of material to really talk about what's actually going on behind the scenes here. So yeah, that's essentially how I ended up sort of keeping these things in. I do a huge amount of other stuff as well. I do have a tendency to talk about philosophy, I think, but then, you can't get by simply doing that kind of stuff, not least because it's bang for your buck. It's not really that worth me doing. I spend a huge amount more time writing those pieces for probably comparable amounts of money than I can to write the sort of shorter form stuff that just has to go out in the daily churn as well. So it's one of those things where we live in a world where if you're going to be in the football media, you have to be a master of all trades. You have to do a bit of podcasting. You have to do a bit of sort of POF writing for industry outlets as well. I edit a gaming website's content and write a bit of stuff for them as well on Rocket League, like something I would never have considered myself doing, right? But that's just what you've got to do. It's a portfolio career. You've got to find the money where the money's available.
I mean, that's pretty interesting you touched upon the whole Saudi takeover, because that was something I had in mind. I read your article on the co-op and I really enjoyed it. I think there's a lot to uncover. I actually read a couple of times to understand everything you touched upon there, because I felt that you touched upon some technical aspects to a layman like me who has an interest in philosophy but hasn't pursued it professionally would understand. So I mean, I would just like for you to expand on what you were thinking during that article, because I felt that there were a lot of things to unpick over there. Things such as Michael Foucault's work, comparing Paris and the whole Saudi consulate in Istanbul and things like that, and later on maybe touch upon sports washing. I mean, that's a lot that I'm asking here, but if you could.
Yeah, so whenever something like this happens, I always have frustration that, particularly in the football media, there's no real clear definition of terms of what we're talking about. And it's been something that's been on my mind for a while. As someone who instinctively reacts against the idea of a state owning a football club, as someone who instinctively reacts against the idea of sort of moneyed ownership in football anyway. But there's the word sports washing you mentioned there is something that's thrown around quite a bit. And I had a suspicion that actually what was happening is that sports washing was just being used as a cipher, to a sort of performative word that can just sort of throw yourself into. Sorry, I think my camera's maybe playing up, but see how it goes. You can throw yourself into using these words, and you can say, look, these are the things that I care about. I think that sports washing is bad. I think that Saudi Arabia is bad, blah, 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 blah. And you've not actually really said anything other than being like, well, we all know it's bad for a state to own a football club because sports washing, it's sort of a catch-all term that people just kind of hang their criticism off. And then people actually hope that you don't actually interrogate it too much. So I was thinking about this, and I just wanted to maybe interrogate it a little bit more, and see what was going on. And so I sorry, I'm just trying to fix my camera here on the fly, but is that better? Can you see me now?
Yeah, better.
So I wanted to dig a little bit beneath the surface and think, right, what actually is the issue with sports washing? What actually are the terms of the debate? What's actually in crisis here? And I guess for me, at the same time, I've been reading a little bit about Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault has a particular understanding of history, a reading of history that focuses on power dynamics in history. So rather than doing what we think, or reading history in the way that we think that it happens, where it's sort of people doing things and having causal impact on things. So if I go out and think this is what needs to change, then something changes, and that's how it goes. Michel Foucault wants to look a little bit more at the sort of underlying ideas whereby people are trying to achieve things in order to gain more power, essentially. And I thought this was a really generative way of looking at the issue with what was going on in Saudi Arabia, because sports washing essentially admits that. It says sports washing is this, that you've got to look beneath the surface of what's happening and find out what the power dynamics are. Why might Saudi Arabia want to buy Newcastle United? It's not simply that they think it's going to make them money. There's obviously all kinds of other ideas that are going on behind the scenes. And that's all well and good, and I think that's a really fruitful place to start from. But what's really interesting is that when you read Michel Foucault, he actually blows open the narrative about the way that power disperses within society, and does so in a way that actually is quite critical of the way that football operates. So it's not so. It's easy then, I think, to punch down on nations like Saudi Arabia, where they have public executions, where they won't allow women to drive, where they flog people as a form of punishment, where homosexuality is banned, etc., etc. It's easy to punch down on those, but actually I think what Michel Foucault says is actually these nations are almost at a disadvantage because they're so blatant in the way that they're dispersing power that the power actually loses some effect. And then what you have to start doing is thinking, well, how do these other nations, the Western democracies that we live in, how do they disperse their power? And as soon as you start applying that narrative to football, you start saying, well, it's not quite so simple as just being like the idea of Saudi Arabia owning a sports team is bad. You have to raise questions about the notions of private ownership of football clubs. When you're talking about rich men or women owning football clubs, it's not the case that those ideas are entirely unproblematic. And so for me, the use of Michel Foucault is just a really useful way of actually blowing open that whole debate about Saudi Arabia and sports washing. And you get to the end of it, and I don't think you paint Saudi Arabia in any better of a picture than you might do at the beginning, but you certainly paint a lot of Western democracies in much worse ways, and the Premier League itself, and its desire to sort of use money and power to ruin a game that a lot of people just enjoy on face value. So that's just the premise of the article. I don't know if I answered all of the questions that you wanted from that, but obviously we can bounce ideas.
Yeah, I mean, there was, so I think I picked up something from the article. So you called it micro power versus macro power. So in the way that how the Western media may perceive it to be totally wrong of what the Saudis or what the Manchester City ownership are doing to club ownership in the UK. But and you linked it to things such as the Tory government in the UK and what kind of policies they are implementing basically on ground level, which we as common men would not know of. But then we just perceive that to be okay because they just hide it in a way that's not seen to the public eye, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, a great example of this is the way that the UK is dealing with the coronavirus. Here's an example of a situation where a huge amount of people will die, more than should have died, probably, if the government had dealt with things in a different way. And yet, in this country, we see the government's approval ratings going up, the opposition parties' approval ratings going down or remaining the same, and then you're starting to recognize actually this is still power being dispersed. There's the concern here in the UK amongst the government has always been protection of moneyed interests, and the Tory party will still do that. And so for them, the only real concern the main concern that they have with this virus is that it stops the economy from working. And why does that concern? Not because they worry about the economy in the classical sense of the term, in terms of the way that the country is able to keep itself alive, is able to give people a standard of life that is worth living, but because they have protection of the people at the top of that society, and have no interest whatsoever in changing that economy so that it works for the benefit of the common person. And so that's the concern for me, is that even in this situation, you think this is apocalyptic in many respects. Yeah. This is the worst case scenario that we could imagine, really. And still they're coming out of it able to disperse power in certain ways. And they're in fact made more powerful precisely because people won't question the way that they're doing things. So, and then you end up with this sort of micro versus macro distinction, like which nation is worse? Is Saudi Arabia worse because they executed 184 people last year, or is the UK government worse because they've lied about the figures of how many people are going to die. Already 10,000 people more than the best case scenario, or the good scenario that they said they were aiming towards, have died, and that will continue to go up. And the conservative estimates for excess deaths is up at 55,000. I mean, that's the sticking point for me, is that actually the Tory government, by operating through micropower, have actually been able to oversee the deaths of way more people than the Saudi Arabian government might have done just through public executions, for example.
There's a really interesting point I've noticed of recently, basically. So it's about traditional media houses anywhere in the world, be it in America, and how so taken to an American context. So companies such as this, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, the people are actually moving away from actually trusting these media houses, and they're going to more independent journalists who have their own YouTube setups, who have their own podcasts, if I may say, and actually trusting what they have to say on this. So and you can actually kind of draw parallels to what I see at home in India. I'm not sure if you're aware about the whole Hindutva case and the rage against the Muslim minorities in this country, or even in China, of how that it's very dictatorial in that sense. So where do you come at from when you're looking at these traditional media houses, and how much of a say they have in modern society?
Yeah, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
Instinctive. I mean, it's funny, right? Because I work in the sports media, and in many respects, the sports media is completely unimportant, right? We don't really need the sports media. We could function pretty well without it. And so the stakes of that question, I suppose, are lower than when it comes to the political media. But we've seen a similar, I don't know, democratization of media in sports media, to the extent that now I think there's a recognition that local journalism, with small letters rather than capital letters, is the way forward when it comes to football journalism in many respects. So the big players on the block are the Athletic, and the Athletic they've approached the issue by saying, right, we're going to, traditionally in the UK anyway, sports media has been bundled in a particular way, and that has been attached to the back pages of the mainstream political journals and newspapers. So you generally, the assumption was people will buy their newspaper based on the political leaning of the newspaper, and then you get whatever sports journalism is attached to the back. Now, obviously, there's going to be some people, I guess, who will prefer sports journalism to news journalism, and will go the other way around, right? So you buy the newspaper with the sports journalism in it that you like, and then you sort of get the politics thrown in. And what the Athletic are doing is they're taking a huge gamble in coming to the UK and saying, actually, the way that this has been done in the UK is ripe for change. Can we now start bundling our journalism with respect to just sports itself rather than the news? So we'll try and get people following us because they like, take me, for example, I'm a Leeds fan. So the Athletic had Phil Hay, who was one of the biggest Leeds United journalists who works for the Yorkshire Evening Post. They picked him up, and they picked a huge amount of subscribers to their platform just because of him. Now, on top of that, you get other things. You get investigative journalists, you get Premier League journalists, you get whatever it is that you might want to read. And so what you're starting to do there is say, well, if we can get people bundling their content with respect to sports rather than politics, then we've got a good chance of maybe picking up a subscription model of journalism, which I think is very interesting. But we see this sort of dispersing through the whole of the football media. So I think there's a huge amount of interest now, I think, in specific fan-oriented media. So I mean, for example, I run a Leeds United media account which focuses on stats and tactics because there was a niche in the market. That's the sort of interesting. I have a sort of interest in that sort of approach, and so I thought, well, here's a niche. Let's attach ourselves to it. We picked up 7,000 Twitter followers in the first season that we were running, and that was this season, a season which hasn't even finished properly. And what we've been able to do with that is we've been able to monetize it through Patreon, and we've created a niche for ourselves on the social media sphere where we put out a huge amount of data visualization, and we talk about stats, and we'll do tactics previews before games, and people want that, and that's what people are far more trusting of going to a media channel like ours than necessarily going to the national mainstream media, for obvious reasons, because the mainstream media have to have to deal with everything all at once. And this is where the Athletic gets its edge, right? Because you can say, we've got a specialist but Brighton journalist. So if you're a Brighton fan, you know that your club is going to be covered properly by someone who's spending their whole life just dealing with the issues that are going on in that club. If you subscribe to The Independent, or if you follow your news through your media, your sports team, through the Guardian, you're not going to get a piece every few days on your specific club. And even when it is, you're going to be like, well, this is just a journalist who's taken a few days to write something about my club. It's not going to be as good as someone who's working for an outlet that's bundling its sports around local news. So I do think that context, I think when you then push it out onto the wider world and talk about it in terms of news and political leanings, that's part of the reason why I think there's a distrust of, or a mistrust of, places like CNN or I mean, whatever you want to talk about, because these sites pitch themselves generally as being neutral in a certain sense. I mean, obviously there's no such thing as political neutrality, but their big selling point is that you can come to us and you'll get a balanced view of what the news is. And I think what the realization is slowly becoming, that people don't want balance when it comes to news. People have opinions, they have approaches, and they want those to be confirmed. You can find any number of Leeds fan sites on Twitter or on the wider internet who will push certain sort of fan-friendly approaches to the club, and they get thousands of followers and huge amounts of subscribers. So I think that's what's happened. There's been a realization that you can bundle content differently, and people are now willing to pay for the stuff that they feel as though they're curating. So there's an opportunity for them to pick and choose what sources their information comes through, and I guess that's hit the mainstream media hard. But at the same time, whenever I talk about the media, I always talk about a sort of symbiotic relationship between the centre, the mainstream, and the periphery media, and that's always going to happen. The mainstream media always has to be small c conservative. They have a huge amount of money behind them, so that means that they can do what they want with their approach. They're always going to be the mainstream, but people on the periphery have to innovate because they don't have that monetary backing. And what happens is a sort of general life cycle in which the mainstream media are always a little bit slow to the innovation. The periphery media is always going to be innovating. And then what happens is the people on the periphery who are really good get bought up by the mainstream media. And so the mainstream media has a slow churn as well. So I think sometimes that we can get carried away in the media thinking, the mainstream is going to just die out, and eventually the periphery media will become bigger, fan media will become bigger, and that's largely true. But you do see the mainstream slowly adapting to things. They slowly adapt to what it is that their audience want in terms of podcasting or YouTubing or whatever might be the case. Getting on Facebook, learning how Google algorithms work, using TikTok as a means of engaging with their audience as well. So it's a constant symbiosis of the media world, where new ideas slowly get taken up by the mainstream media. And I think the mainstream media sort of peaks and troughs as trends change in terms of technology. And sometimes you'll have a couple of years where you feel as though the mainstream are dropping off a little bit, but then they'll realize that there's money to be had by bringing in people from the periphery, and they'll do that well. And the Athletic again is a great example of that. That's the mainstream trying to evolve and adapt in a fairly inhospitable climate at the moment.
No, I mean, I'm a big fan of the Athletic myself, and I kind of agree with all the points you've made there. And I feel that for a general fan like me, who's obviously a Liverpool fan but likes to read about other things as well, the Athletic is a platform where I can easily do that without actually going to the Liverpool Echo, where I'll only get Liverpool-based news and things like that. I think James Pearce really touched upon it really well. So he's obviously probably the finest Liverpool writer they have. And he mentioned that when he was working for the traditional media houses, it was very match report based. So everything had to be out by 9 a.m. or whatever. But at The Athletic, he gets so much time to write about long form content, which is something I personally enjoy. I mean, some people may like the tidbits of what actually happened in the match, but I kind of like the long form writing sense of that. And I feel that through the Athletic, that's really what's been brought out. So if you have an idea as a journalist of covering covering a story in Turkey or covering a story in China, let's say, they would understand the rationale behind it, and then they'll probably fly you to Turkey or fly you to China if they see that this is a good marketable story or something that needs to be told. Which if you went out to the traditional media houses, they'd say that, yeah, but how much would that cost, and how can we run this in the schedule, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. And again, like the Athletic has a huge amount of venture capital behind it, and so this for me feels like an all or nothing attempt by them to really reinvent the world of sports media. Maybe it will work, maybe it won't. But like you say, I think for people like you who enjoy long form, slow journalism, that it's often called, that's a really beneficial development. But this is the thing, right? They're a subscription model, and so what they've got to try and do is garner the subscriptions, and then they've got to constantly fight for renewal, and so that is going to require innovation. So again, broadly speaking, that seems like a beneficial thing in the long run. And yeah, look, the media has changed. This is the long and short of it. No, we don't need match day media. Match day media became pointless in the 2000s, right? Pretty much onwards. As soon as you have social media, you have people at the game able to share what's going on in terms of. I mean, as soon as you make a television-based approach to you have TV broadcasting revenue, people know what's going on. We don't need to. It's no longer the case that the media act as the name suggests, as a medium between the fans and the club, because that's just that social media has simply deflated that need. We've never had more access really to players than we have now, interestingly enough, and yet at the same time we've never had less access, right? Because clubs are realizing that they can go in-house, they can control their media images through their own internal media departments, and so they can sever that tie between the club and the fans as well. So between those two things, media going in-house in clubs, and actually social media and TV broadcasting making the game more available to anyone, has meant that actually traditional media really doesn't have the same function that it did. And that's why I think it's good that the Athletic are thinking of interesting ways around that problem. And that, again, it's good for me because it allows me to interrogate philosophical questions, which, I think that the media can do that too. That, think of interesting approaches to the issues that are facing us, rather than tell us the details about the game, who scored, what was, because we've all seen the game, we all watched it, so we don't need them to tell us what's going on. I mean, there's still that need, obviously, to go behind the scenes and tell us the stories, but even then, no one really needs to do that anymore. I mean, someone like myself who has a lot of contacts in the data analysis world, that's now a great resource for me to talk about transfer rumours, because these clubs now are considering players 6, 12, 18 months before they buy them. So if you know someone who's working in an analytics department at a club and they leak you information about something, you're way further ahead of the curve than most traditional journalists in terms of their sources, because their sources will be, agents, they'll have that, and they'll have people at the club as well. But in terms of the people at the club now who are sources, they're so much further down the line in terms of their information garnering, that it's no longer useful. So I think we've got to a point now where people realise that transfer rumour and gossip is a lot of the mainstream media that do that are just throwing out news based on agents trying to generate value for their players just through rumours, right? Whereas actually there are now resources that you can go to that will actually give you a much better sense of whether or not a club is interested in a player than an agent. So it's all of this by way of saying the media landscape is constantly changing, and the media outlets have to respond to that. And if they don't, they will die. So that's why the Athletic, I think, is interesting, because it feels like a mainstream attempt to solve a problem in the media landscape.
No, that's pretty interesting, because I listen to these two podcasters. They're based out of America and Canada, respectively. So it's Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. So they're a big psychologist, and I think Sam Harris is a neurologist. So They talk. So he's basically specialized in neuroscience, but they talk about how if you want quality content, then in the model age you have to have the consumer pay for it, if that makes sense. And they've shown a platform in which they've actually been successful with their platforms of how it's paid content, but the content is quality, if that makes sense. And that's what the Athletics manifesto is as well, that if the consumer is paying for content, the content has to be good quality. Doesn't matter if it takes 3 days to for the individual to write it a week. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I don't agree with when it comes to Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, but when it comes to paying for content, certainly you have to. There's certainly truth in that, right? Especially in, I think, the sports media, there are issues, and this is something again that we've seen through the coronavirus here in the UK, is that if the government are often leaking information or briefing people in the mainstream media. So for example. The Telegraph, for example, is an outlet that the government use. Boris Johnson used to be a journalist there, so they'll often leak information through there. And there was an instance where they put something through and it was on a paywall. Or maybe it might have been the Times, actually, the big example of this. But you couldn't actually read this. It was a government mandated leak which gave information about what was happening with respect to coronavirus response, and it was on a paywall, so you couldn't actually get it without having paid. And there's a huge ethical question there, right? If you're talking about an issue where the government are recommending a certain course of action, if only people who pay for the access to that get that, then it becomes a huge problem, because you're essentially saying, well, there's a whole underclass of people who might not pay for this outlet, or who can't even afford it, who are going to not be able to get the information firsthand. So I certainly think that there has to be a question asked when it comes to news outlets about how you might disseminate information through a paywall, so that you're not simply saying that information about something like a coronavirus, a global pandemic, is only available to certain people. But in the sports media, I don't see there's necessarily any reason why you might have to worry about that. But yeah, I think this is the thing, right? It used to be the case that we lived in a world where people paid for their newspapers. That's a subscription model. You paid for your newspaper, you got your journalism, and that you've got an obvious correlation there between, if people buying your paper, then you can pay the people who are writing it. And then as soon as the internet came in and the assumption was that content should be free, you then have a problem immediately for the media, because you now have lost any notion of income. And as soon as you make it about advertising revenue, as soon as that becomes the model in which your money is arriving in terms of a media outlet, you're encouraging clickbait. It's just the long and short of it. You're encouraging clickbait. You're encouraging people putting out a huge amount of content, because if you put out 2 pieces, you're gonna get 2 times as many hits. You're gonna get twice as much advertising revenue, in theory. I mean, I know it's more complicated than that, but it does mean that you do end up boiling down everything into sort of quantity rather than quality, and so that's an issue as well. That's why a subscription model is good, because in theory, I mean, the Athletic, as we've already said, have a huge amount of venture capital behind them, but in theory they want to be self-sustaining. They want to be able to do what they do and say, we can do this because we are getting paid for it by people to do this, and yeah, that's the dream of media. But yeah, until we get to a point where people recognise that the good content has to be paid for in some way, then we're always going to be fighting that battle of how does the media survive in that media landscape.
John, listen, I mean, I know we only have a little bit of time today, so I kind of want to touch on Bielsa, because my friends at uni know that I'm also Bielsa obsessive. I know you're probably the most famous one on Twitter and the one who's always talking about him. So I kind of want to understand just things about Bielsa from you. I mean, I know you're in the process of writing a book on Bielsa. I know you've actually asked him a question at a press conference. So just anything you may know about him. So maybe just starting off, growing up in Argentina when he was, even though he was born into a family that was well off in terms of Argentine society, of how I'm not too sure on this, but I think there were politicians and lawyers, his family members, but he still pursued his dream of working in football. So just whatever, and I can probably if I want to ask any question, I'd probably do that then.
Yeah. So what I find so fascinating about Bielsa is that he's a complicated character, and there's so few really like openly complicated characters in football. That's what really attracted me to him. That's why I'm writing a book about him. And even just mentioning his family there, I think, is interesting because his father comes from an aristocratic Argentine family, but his mother came from a poorer part of Argentina, and basically worked her way up to being a teacher, and so what you start seeing, I think, when you read through Bielsa's life, is you start seeing that just sort of contradictions and paradoxes all the way through. He has an aristocratic father and a working class mother, and he fits into this Argentine tradition of football where everyone allegedly likes Menotti or Bilardo, and he doesn't really. He sort of takes bits from both of them. And you see this all the way through, I think, his career, is that he's very, very hard to categorize. You can't fit him into easy categories because he will always blow them open. And you get that again from when you follow his press conferences as well. The sort of sort of cut and dried opinions that you'd expect him to have, he doesn't have. He's sort of held up as being a left-wing hero, and I don't think that's helpful either. I think if you sort of interrogate the political background that he comes from, and even Peronism in Argentina is a hugely complicated political reality anyway. But again, with Peronism, you have this weird amalgamation of sort of sociology. Let me say this again: socialist ideas, but also certain sort of right-wing ideas when it comes to economy and how you would make that work. And so, again, what I'm trying to do in the book is I'm trying to interrogate some of those paradoxes. And in many respects, the book is really just a book of essays that have Marcelo Bielsa as a theme. And they sort of go here, there, and everywhere, looking at various aspects of things that I find interesting about football, but using him as a sort of jumping off point, and simply because I find him the most interesting and compelling person in football. So I think that's what it comes down to. He's a sort of very complex individual who actually blows open a lot of the boring ideological and narrative like ideas that people have about football, where they're like, this is one thing, this is the other, and you're either one or the other, and he sort of comes in and sits in between those two, and suddenly makes it the whole situation more complicated.
So I think I've heard you talk about that when you were actually reading up about Bielsa, and just when you were fascinated about him, and I'm pretty sure you still are, but you found that there wasn't really a good book that was written on him, and that's probably what probably made you maybe have an interest of writing a book on him. But do you feel that's because people find it hard to categorize him, as you said, so they can't really pen a book down on saying that's what Bielsa is or that's what he stands for, if that makes sense?
So the only books really that are out there, I mean, there's a new book that's come out by Tim Rich in English. It's the first proper biography. I'm sure it's a very good book. I've not read it yet. That is on my to-read list. But all the other books, there's a couple in Spanish, there's a couple in French, and I've read all of them. And they're generally quite good. But the problem is that these are all biographical books, right? And the problem with biography is that there's an assumption, and there's a political and philosophical assumption at the beginning of these books, which is, I'm going to tell you the story of this guy's life. And it gives you this notion that actually what you're doing here is trying to find a definitive picture, and you're just going to say, this is what happened to him. And there's no sort of self-awareness about the fact that actually whoever is writing a book about Bielsa is going to be writing about him from an angle. And I find that really unhelpful, precisely because I think Bielsa, because of what I've said already about Bielsa, he's so hard to get a grasp on that if you try and say, here's a definitive biography of Bielsa, what you're doing is you're automatically reducing him down and making him less interesting than he is. And so for me, the real, I guess the real problem that I'm trying to solve with my book, and the first chapter basically is, how do you write about Bielsa? And that you won't get that in biographies, right? Because when you're writing a biography, really, you have to have that assumption that you can write a biography. You have to have that assumption that what I'm doing here is useful. The world will be better off for me sitting down and telling you the history of Marcelo Bielsa's life. And you can do good biographies, don't get me wrong. I don't want to just punch down on the concepts of biography. But for me, the most important thing is, how do you write about a man who actively doesn't want people to write about him? How do you write about a man who is working in an industry where people prioritize the press conference as being some kind of like oracular performance where a dude sits in front of you and tells you exactly what he thinks? Does anyone even believe that? Does anyone actually think that a manager who sits in a press conference in front of the media is giving you a heart-to-heart, is telling you exactly what it is that he thinks? And that's the only access we have to Marcelo Bielsa, because since 1994 or wherever it was, he decided that he wasn't going to give interviews one-on-one, essentially. And so what you're doing when you're writing a biography of Marcelo Bielsa is you're saying, effectively, I'm going to go through his life. I'm going to listen to people who've given me secondhand stories about him. I'm going to take what he said in press conferences, and that's it. That's what you're going from. And for me, that's already a hugely philosophical or political approach to the issue, because that question is always lingering. That's the elephant in the room, right? How can we possibly write a book about someone who isn't going to give you the material that you might need to write a biography of him, really? Now, obviously, that then raises questions about, well, can you write biographies about anyone? And that's a good question. And obviously, we would still be trying to write these biographies with that self-awareness. But for me, I think, you've got to start from that question. Well, how do you write about Bielsa, and how might you go about doing it in a different way to how you might write a biography about anyone else? Because I'm sure, you can write a biography about Steve McManaman and it would be fine. It would be, but when we're talking about Steve McManaman, we're not talking about someone who's interesting in the same way that Marcelo Bielsa is. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure Steve McManaman is a complex individual. I'm sure he has his desires and his hopes and dreams and, struggles with things that he likes, he doesn't like, whatever. But with Marcelo Bielsa, it's almost like that's his very existence is to be that sort of ethereal, mysterious, esoteric character. And as soon as you just commit to being like, I'm going to write about his life, you cut through that. And so I guess for me, that the whole of the book is going to be, how can you write about Marcelo Bielsa without actually writing him out of the book, making him sort of unattractive, unappealing as a topic of conversation.
Yeah. I mean, is that why that's taking a lot of time? I understand that you probably have it planned, and I mean, fair play. I mean, I'd rather want it to be good than having it scheduled for a particular time of release. So yeah, I mean, all the best on working for that. But something I wanted to touch upon is his obsessive nature and his strive for perfectionism. So maybe if you could touch upon that. And do you think he actually has a right way to play football, or some ideals or a philosophy or like what the media banned about when he actually talks about?
Yeah. So there's two questions there. One of them is about his personality.
Yeah.
And then the other one is about his idealism with football.
If he believes in a philosophy, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about the second one first, because I think that's probably the easiest one to attack at this point. Whether or not he has an idealistic way of conceiving of football. Is there one way of playing football for him? And I think this is really interesting, because I think in many respects Marcelo Bielsa just lives by the principle that you have to assume that there is an ideal way of playing football. There may not be, but as a coach, you have to do that. And there's plenty of interviews where he's given where he said, if you don't believe in your system, how can you ever expect your players to believe in your system? And so he has gone down the route of being like, I've chosen a system that I prefer, that I think is the best, and I'm going to treat it as though it is the only one. Yeah. But at the same time, I don't think that, like, if you sat him down philosophically and said, these are other ways of playing football, what do you think of them? I think he would have insightful views about them. I think he would see the merits of those systems and would argue that there is something worthwhile in them. Whether or not that's the best approach to football, this sort of hyper idealism, is another question entirely. And I don't know whether or not he would whether or not there might be a better way of putting it out there. But again, this comes down to what I'm saying is that Marcelo Bielsa is someone who's hyper aware of the image that he portrays. Okay, and so this comes back to my last question, right? If you write a biography about a man who is very hyper aware of the image that he puts out, you're not writing a biography about that person. You're writing a hagiography of the image that they put out, right? And you're sort of playing into the ideals of what it is that they want people to perceive. And with Marcelo Bielsa, I don't think that's done vindictively. I don't think he's doing that because he wants to trick the media. I think he's doing that because he realizes that the image that he puts out is really important for the way that his team performs. So he'll give plenty of press conferences where he'll talk about 4 or 5 different players in the course of a season as being the most important player for us this season. Now, is he being inconsistent? I don't think so. I think he realizes that actually he plays that press conference plays an important role in his players being confident and playing the way that he wants them to play. And so again, you're again seeing here the reason why it might be problematic to just write an unproblematic biography of a man who is not. It's not that he's trying to manipulate people, but he treats the media, his dealings with the media, as secondary importance to his dealings with the team and the club and whatever. So another great example of this, I think, is that if you talk about him in terms of legacy, I think the media always will talk about what have you actually produced in terms of results, trophies, and medals, etc. Whereas I think if you asked him, he would say, what are the things that I have achieved in my life? He would say, I've built a training ground at Newell's Old Boys that has put this club on a footing that no other club in the same position in Argentina would have. And I don't think the media would ever conceive that might be considered by him as being one of his finest achievements, but it is. I think if you were to ask him the same about his time at Leeds, yes, of course, he'd be pleased that he's got Leeds playing the best football that they have and almost likely promoted into the Premier League, the first manager to do that since they went down. But at the same time, I think he would be hugely proud of the training facilities at Thorpe Arch. I think he would be hugely proud of the fact that he's turned around the club in a sense, not just in a monetary sense, because there's still questions about whether or not anyone can do that and whether or not he's done that anyway, but in the sense that people are now proud to be Leeds fans again. And for him, those things are as important, I think, as medals and trophies. And so again, when you're talking about him, you have to realise that you can't simply base your ideas about him on what he says, because actually, I think for him, the media's view of itself is unhelpful because they sort of see themselves as winkling out information from important people, whereas for him, he treats that press conference as a situation for him to achieve the things that he wants in other areas. He can get his team playing in certain. He can get his team feeling good about themselves. And also he can communicate with the fans. He can say to the fans, "Look, I realise that you put a huge amount of time, effort, and money into Leeds United, and I feel responsible as an individual to give you the information that you require as well." So I think once you take those two things into account, then you have to realise that there's a little bit more going on with Marcelo Bielsa than you might think. So yeah, that's in answer to the question about the idealism approach. The first question, you'll have to remind me what it was because
so it was more about of his obsessive nature and his strive for perfectionism, basically.
Okay, yeah. And now there's a chapter on this as well in the book, because again, there's an assumption. I think there's an assumption in football that people, in terms of their neuro personalities, that everyone is the same, right? Footballers are just sort of blokes that go out, play football on a pitch. Women, obviously. But they are, at the end of the day, just people who have sort of standard personalities and it doesn't really come into it. And football, I think, there's not really a huge amount of scope given for people who might be neuroatypical. So people who are autistic, who would be on the spectrum in some sense. And I'm convinced that Marcelo Bielsa is. And so I have a whole chapter on in the book about that. Like, how do you write about someone who maybe is neuroatypical? What's the ethics of even doing that? What's the ethics of me coming out and saying I think that this guy sees the world in a different way to the standard way, the typical ways that people do it, the mainstream ways. And so I find that really fascinating as well. And you can't. Again, how can you write a book about someone's life if you don't take into account the way that their brain works or the way that they see the world? And so I think that's a really fascinating aspect to him as well. So yeah, again, all of these things just come back to that original question, like why write a book about Marcelo Bielsa? Because the answer to that for me is like, how could you, if you wanted to write a book about anything in football, how could it be on anything that isn't Marcelo Bielsa?
Yeah. No, so touching about this particular question of him being really obsessive and things like that. So I kind of do agree that if you say that he looks at life in a certain lens, and that's how he wants it to be portrayed, and that's how he portrays himself in that particular sense. If that mean, where I'm going with this is that, do you think, so it's about the training sessions that he takes over at Leeds. So do you think that everything is so rehearsed, there's a lot of repetition that takes place? And I think you've referred to this in one of the podcasts, calling it very similar to how a pianist would probably perform. So even though it's rehearsed, it's a form of art, if that makes sense, or that's how he views it. So can you expand upon that point, basically?
Yeah, so Jonathan Wilson mentions, I can't remember off the top of my head the Spanish word that Jonathan Wilson uses. Interestingly enough, actually, it's in both Inverting the Pyramid and Angels with Dirty Wings.
Great books.
And I did a huge...
Great books, by the
way. Great book, yeah. Yeah, no, of course, totally. But in both of those books, he's talking about the concept of what Marcelo Bielsa's sort of approach to the way that football should be played is, and it's like you said, musical analogies are really good here. It's not like ad-libbing. It's not like he's just making things up on the spot, but it is about being able to take a theme and then I guess take that theme and do interesting and creative things with it. So whenever you're talking about Marcelo Bielsa's approach to tactics, I think there always has to be a realization that, one, there is that rigidity there that you say, and it's just micromanaged. There's plenty of YouTube clips of his training sessions if you want to find them. Most of them are a little bit old now, but if you do that, one of the things that will blow your mind is just about how he micromanages everything. He wants everything to be done in his way, and I think I think that's all well and good. But at the same time, he's also talked about virtuoso. So it's not like there's the famous quote about him saying, if football was played by robots, I would be the best manager. But at the same time, there are other quotes where he does use that musical metaphor, where he's suggesting that, it's only once you are robotic, so only once you really understand the theme that we're extemporizing on, that you can actually go out and do that ad-libbing. So again, it's that and his time at Leeds United actually is an excellent example of that. So if you look at Leeds United last season compared to this season they've been tactically way more interesting. He's been tactically at least very, very, very progressive in many respects, which he wasn't last season, and that just comes down to the fact that he now trusts the team to be able to do that more. And so you end up this really fascinating. We with the football being off, Josh Hobbs and I, he helps me out on the Leeds United channel that we run. We just spent a little bit of time looking back at some games from last season and this season, and trying to decide what was the peak Bielsa game at Leeds in his time at Leeds, and it's just remarkable going back and watching games from last season. You don't realise just quite how far the change has come. The team has come, and I do find that I do think that comes down to the fact that it is about that rigidity, but that rigidity actually allows him to give the team freedom. So again, here's another paradox: the more you understand the system, the more you can be free, which doesn't seem to make sense. But again, there's another paradox for you. So I think, does that answer the question?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, there's another thing I kind of want to unpick here. So I'm not sure if you've probably heard of the name of John Piaget. He's probably one of the best behavioral psychologists. So he talks about, when we're looking at sports and why people are fascinated by sports, is because it's kind of a miniature form of life, if that makes sense. And in a way, life is a series of games or a series of sports that you play. So where he basically took it was that there is a right way of playing, because until and unless you don't play the right way, you won't be called to multiple games. As a result, you won't be able to win multiple trophies. So, for example, this goes again to the whole Bielsa versus Bielsa versus Mourinho and Conte camp, where they may feel that that's the best approach to take for one particular game, and that might win you the game. But when you're looking at a series of games like a league stage, then that's what wins you titles, and then you can progress this into life as well. That's how people will actually see you in a good light of saying that, yeah, that's the right way of playing, if that makes sense. It's kind of disjointed, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think the way that I would explain that is just in terms of like high risk and low risk probabilities. I think, you know, that's sort of for me the difference between, I mean, maybe Guardiola versus Klopp is unfair, but when it comes to Guardiola, because he's such a low risk manager, he wants to make sure that his teams are in a position where they're going to be able to control the ball. Over the course of a season, you're going to be more likely to win, right? That's the logic behind it. Whereas I guess Klopp, before he became Liverpool god level Klopp, and then that's a sign of a great manager, right? That he can adapt in the way that he has. But I think before it felt as though Klopp was a sort of big game manager where he could get a sort of run of good results out of a team, and that's great for when you want to win the Champions League, right? And what we've seen, what's so fascinating about Klopp and Guardiola is that it's almost like the big challenge in their life is how do you win the competition, which is not the one that is best suited to your approach, right? Guardiola is like most of the time going to win the Premier League, you'd expect, with the players that he has and with the way that he plays football. And yet he wants to win the Champions League, and we saw the same with Klopp. You know, Klopp has had a really good record in the Champions League. Maybe not Champions League finals, but certainly getting his teams a long way in them. And yet the thing he wants to win is the league. So again, I think that's probably says something about the form of pragmatism that you need to be able to win a huge. When you need to win like whatever it is, 36 games, 38 games in a season, it's different to having to win a series of whatever it is, 8, 12 games or something that you have to win to get to the Champions League final. So yeah, I think that there's probably some truism in that. There's probably a structural reality about football that just inheres in the nature of football as a sport. There's only so much you can do, right, in football, and there's going to be innovation, but unless you change the parameters of the pitch or change the number of players on there, or introduce certain handicaps. And that's why rules are so important, right? Because the rules are so important to the actual reality of the game. So I think that strikes me as being a truism about the game. How that applies to Bielsa, I don't know, but he certainly plays beautiful football as well, which I think he thinks is important.
Yeah, I mean, so there's this whole thing. So I mean, let's take a thought experiment. Let's say Bielsa is in a Europa League final or a Champions League final, let's say, and it's against a team that he has to maybe choose a style which is very pragmatic. Do you think for him as an individual, it would even be a thought in his mind that he could actually do that? But a side note to that is that would provide maybe a lot of joy to the people of Leeds that they probably remember for centuries on. Or would he still stick to that rigid style? But he'd probably say that if I don't stick to my rigid style right now, then they probably will perceive me to be that, okay, this is one game instance, and just to win this particular match, he'll probably just throw his tactics out of the window.
Yeah, I mean, I think the quote that he would give there would be that, like, the question is always asked, especially Leeds fans, were like, when we would have games where we would dominate the game and then lose, it would be like, why didn't we use plan B? And I think the quote is always like, what, I don't have a plan B, I just have plan A, but do it better, right? That's the approach that he would have. So again, I think when it comes to systems, I think people expect your plan B to just be a completely different system, whereas I think with Bielsa, the realization is that there's an overarching system, but then within that system you make tweaks, you do changes, you switch players around, you change certain aspects of your approach within that system until you overcome the issues that the opposition system is providing, right? And I think that will be the way that he would talk about it. He says, our system can beat any other system as long as we're doing within that system the right things. And the amount of preparation that goes into every game he goes into is such that he is thinking about, right, what part of the system should we be utilising this week to be able to get what we want to achieve.
Listen, John, it was a pleasure speaking to you. I know we're short on time today, but it was great pleasure. I mean, I think there's mutual love for us for Bielsa, and it was great understanding the whole the landscape of football journalism as well. So anything you'd like to plug, feel free to, or any final words that you may have.
So if you want to find the stuff that I'm doing, probably Twitter is the best place to go to. So I'm at Jon_Mackenzie on Twitter. And then the other thing I guess I would push is I work for a podcast called Football Today, which is a daily style podcast looking beneath the surface of some of the bigger news stories in football and giving a little bit more context. So if that's interesting to you, you can go to footballtodaypodcast.com or go to Twitter at ft_podcast_. And they're the two places that most of my stuff will be up.
Oh, that's great, man. I hope when I'm back in the UK, maybe we can do it sometime when we're sitting closer, maybe, or something like that. But anyway, great speaking to you, man. I hope
thank you.
again. Yeah, all right. See you then.
Bye-bye.